The replacement's name was O'Connell. Private Arthur O'Connell. He arrived with 3 other greenhorns on a deuce and a half that churned the November mud into a thick, brown soup that looked like it could swallow a manhole. It was 1944, and the Hurtgen Forest was doing its best to prove it could. The other 3 kids had the decency to look terrified, their eyes wide, their knuckles white on their brand-new M1 rifles. They looked like they'd just stepped out of a recruiting poster and into hell's front yard. But O'Connell, he was different. He had the same clean uniform, the same unscratched helmet, but he was looking at the shattered trees and the corpse-gray sky like he was visiting a museum. An art gallery, maybe. He was a skinny kid from New York City, barely 19, with long fingers better suited for holding a paintbrush than a rifle. He told us that, too, on the first day. Told Corporal Greco he'd been in art school before the draft board sent him his invitation to the great European vacation. Greco, who'd been a butcher in Philadelphia and had seen things in this forest that would make a man forget what colors even were, just stared at him. Then he spat a wad of tobacco juice near the kid's spotless boots and walked away. That was the last time O'Connell mentioned being an artist. But he didn't have to. You could see it in the way he carried himself, the way he looked at things. He wasn't seeing the danger. He was seeing the composition. It was unnatural. I'm Sergeant Frank Riley. My men just call me Sarge. It's not a nickname born of affection. It's just a fact. I'm the one who keeps them alive, and I do it by being the meanest, hardest son of a bitch they've ever met. I have to be. We were part of Bradley's push, but down here in the dirt, names like that didn't mean much. We weren't soldiers in a grand army. We were just men trying not to die in the next 5 minutes. My platoon had been bled white, taking a single godforsaken hill, and these new replacements were the fresh blood meant to plug the holes. To me, they were just holes waiting to be filled with something other than mud. And this O'Connell kid, he looked like the biggest hole of them all. His first mistake came during inspection. I was walking the line, checking weapons. Most of the new boys had their rifles clean enough to eat off of, just like they learned in basic. I got to O'Connell. He was standing there, a little notepad sticking out of his breast pocket. I ignored it for the moment. Present arms, private, I barked. He fumbled the M1, the heavy rifle clattering against his helmet before he caught it. The wood was still slick with cosmoline, but there was a smear of mud near the trigger guard. He hadn't cleaned it properly after the truck ride. I leaned in close, my voice low and rough. You think that Garand is a toy? You think Jerry is going to wait for you to wipe the mud off before he drills a hole through that pretty face of yours? He just stared back, his eyes blinking. No, Sergeant. That was it. No excuse. Nothing. He just looked ashamed. I snatched the notepad from his pocket. It was full of sketches. Charcoal drawings of the shattered trees, of another soldier's tired face, of a broken farmhouse we'd passed. I crumpled the page I was looking at and threw the pad back at his chest. Your job is to watch your sector, clean your weapon, and follow my orders. It is not to draw pretty pictures of this goddamn nightmare. The real test, of course, was the shelling. Jerry had our sector zeroed in. He liked to send over a few welcoming presents from his 88s around dusk. The first whistle came screaming in, high and thin like a bird of prey. My boys were in their foxholes before the sound even peaked. I dove into mine, peering over the edge to check on the new meat. 3 of them had found cover. O'Connell had not. He was standing frozen in the open, his head tilted up at the sky as if he could see the shell coming. He was a statue of pure, uncut fear. The world erupted in fire and black earth 100 yards away. The concussion wave hit us like a physical blow. I scrambled out of my hole, tackled him to the ground, and dragged him by the collar into the slit trench with me just as the second shell landed, this time closer. Dirt and splinters rained down on us. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. I had him pressed against the muddy wall of the trench, my face an inch from his. You freeze like that again, you're dead, I snarled, my voice barely a whisper over the ringing in my ears. You understand me? You are a liability. You are a danger to every man here. You are not an artist. You are a soldier. Start acting like one. He gave a weak, jerky nod, his eyes looking right through me. He had that 1,000-yard stare already, and he hadn't even seen a German yet. He was a burden, and I knew right then, with the bitter taste of cordite in my mouth, that he was going to get somebody killed. And my job was to make sure it wasn't one of my men. A few days later, a fresh-faced second lieutenant named Davies showed up with a map and a bad idea. He was straight out of officer school, so young his mustache was more of a rumor than a fact. He unrolled the map on the hood of a Jeep, the paper still crisp, and pointed a clean finger at a crossroads marked with a red circle. "Here, Sergeant," he said, his voice full of unearned confidence. "This is Objective Alpha, a Kraut pillbox and a series of machine gun nests controlling the intersection. Command wants it neutralized by 1700. He looked at me, expecting me to be impressed. I looked at the map, then at the wall of green and gray hell that was the forest. The map showed neat little lines and symbols. The forest was a tangled mess of death where maps didn't mean a damn thing. The plan was textbook idiocy. A direct assault up a muddy track that was a natural kill zone. He wanted my platoon to lead, with Baker Company providing suppressing fire from the left flank. It was the kind of plan that looked good to a general like Patton 30 miles behind the lines, but for the men who had to crawl through the mud, it was a wood chipper. I looked at my guys. Greco, Martinez, Preacher, Danforth. They'd all been with me since Normandy. They were tired. Their eyes were hollow, but they were soldiers. They were survivors. And I wasn't about to feed them into a machine gun for a shiny new lieutenant's career. Then I saw O'Connell. He was standing at the edge of the group, not even looking at the map. His gaze was fixed on a ridge to our right, a steep, ugly spine of rock and shattered tree stumps that overlooked the entire approach to the crossroads. He was just looking, the way an artist looks at a canvas before the first stroke. He was seeing the lines, the shadows, the goddamn composition of the battlefield. And in that moment, I saw a solution. A cold, ugly, practical solution to one of my problems. I let the lieutenant finish his speech. Then I pulled him aside. "Sir," I said, my voice respectful but firm. "That ridge to the east. It's a blind spot. If the Krauts have an observer up there, they'll see us coming a mile away. They could walk their mortars right on top of us before we get halfway." Davies frowned, looking at his perfect, clean map where the ridge was just a bunch of brown contour lines. He hadn't even considered it. "I need eyes on that ridge, sir. Someone has to make sure it's clear. A one-man observation post." His eyes lit up. "Good thinking, Sergeant. Proactive. Who will you send?" I looked over his shoulder, straight at O'Connell. "I'll send the new kid." "O'Connell." Davies nodded. "Excellent. Have him take a radio." "No, sir," I said quickly. "A radio is too heavy and the signal is weak in this terrain. A field phone is better. He can run a wire back to us. More secure." It was a lie. A wire was a liability, easily cut by shrapnel. But it was also a leash. A short one. The real reason was simpler. I didn't want him calling for help when things went south. I walked over to O'Connell. The other veterans watched, their faces unreadable. They knew what was happening. It was an old Army tradition, giving the new guy the job most likely to get him killed. "O'Connell," I snapped, and he jumped. "You see that ridge?" I pointed. He nodded, his eyes clear and focused for the first time since he got here. "You're going to take a field phone, a spool of DR-8 wire, and you're going to crawl to the top. You are to find a concealed position and report on any enemy movement you see. Do you understand?" "Yes, Sergeant." His voice was quiet. "You are not to engage. You are not to be seen. You are a ghost. You will lay that wire as you go. If we call you, you answer. Do not call us unless you see a Panzer division rolling down that road." Got it. I was being cruel, and I knew it. I was sending him on a suicide mission. The Germans almost certainly had a listening post up there. At best, he'd get pinned down. At worst, he'd take a bullet before he got 100 yards. Either way, he'd be out of my hair. I wouldn't have to worry about him freezing when the shooting started. Greco handed him the heavy phone and the spool of wire. The kid adjusted the straps, his thin frame struggling with the weight. He looked at me one last time. There was no fear in his eyes now, just a strange sort of acceptance. He gave a slight nod, turned, and started walking toward the tree line, toward the ridge, the copper wire unreeling behind him like a trail of breadcrumbs. I watched him go until the mist and the dark woods swallowed him whole. I didn't expect to ever see him again. I turned back to my squad. "All right," I growled, feeling the cold knot in my stomach tighten. "Forget him. Now let's talk about how we're really going to take that crossroads." One problem was solved. Now I just had to deal with the Germans. The first 100 yards were easy. Too easy. The forest was unervingly quiet, the only sound the squelch of our boots in the god-awful mud and the low grumble of the Sherman tank nicknamed Iron Faith, that was crawling along the track beside us. Up ahead, through the skeletal trees, we could see the crossroads. The concrete pillbox was just a gray lump, silent and seemingly abandoned. My gut tightened. I'd been in this war long enough to know that quiet was usually worse than noise. Quiet meant the enemy was watching, waiting, fingers resting on triggers. I looked over at Greco. He caught my eye and gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He felt it too. Lieutenant Davies, jogging behind the tank like he was on a training exercise, was practically beaming. "See, Sergeant? Piece of cake. They must have pulled back." I didn't answer him. I was watching the windows of a ruined stone farmhouse on the left flank, dark and empty as a dead man's eyes. That's where the trouble would come from. I knew it. Iron Faith clanked past the farmhouse, turning its turret to cover the pillbox. That's when the world ended. There was a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas, the fiery hiss of a Panzerfaust. A brilliant orange blossom erupted on the Sherman side armor. The explosion wasn't as loud as you'd think. It was a deep, metallic thump, followed by a horrible, grinding screech as the tank's tracks seized up. A hatch blew open and a man, his uniform on fire, tried to climb out before collapsing back into the inferno. Black, greasy smoke began to pour from the hull. Our Iron Faith was now a four-man coffin. Before the shock of it even registered, the world was filled with a sound that every GI in Europe had learned to dread in his bones. It was the sound of a zipper, a monstrous, world-eating zipper tearing the fabric of the air at 1,000 rounds a minute. An MG-42. And it wasn't in the pillbox. It was in the farmhouse, exactly where I'd feared. Tracers, like angry green wasps, stitched lines across the open ground, kicking up mud and shredding the trees above our heads. Everyone dove for cover, pressing themselves into the cold, wet earth. Martinez, a good kid from San Antonio, was a half-second too slow. I saw the rounds hit him, saw his body jerk and dance like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He was dead before he hit the ground. "Sparks, get me battalion." I screamed over the din, crawling toward our radio operator. But Sparks was already down, slumped over his set with a dark stain spreading across his back. His radio was a wreck of smashed vacuum tubes and splintered wood. We were cut off. Completely. Then the mortars started, the shells crumping down with terrifying accuracy, bracketing our position. They had us. They had us cold. This wasn't a defensive line. It was a baited trap, a perfectly prepared kill box. The pillbox up ahead was just the cheese. We were the mice. Preacher Danforth was trying to lay down suppressing fire with his bar, but it was like spitting into a hurricane. For every one of his rounds, the MG-42 sent back 100. I saw the terror in my men's eyes. These were veterans, men who had waded ashore on Omaha Beach, but they knew when a situation was hopeless. We were pinned, our armor was gone, and we were taking casualties with every passing second. The medic was screaming that he was out of morphine and plasma. I tried to organize a breakout to the rear, but the Kraut machine gunner had the road completely locked down. To run was to die. To stay was to die. I pressed myself against the roots of a massive, overturned tree, the bark and mud flying around me as the MG-42 raked the ground. I cursed Davies. I cursed Patton. I cursed the whole damn war. I had led my men into this. The lieutenant's plan was suicide, and I had walked right along with it. In the chaos and the roaring of the guns, with the smell of cordite and blood thick in my throat, I didn't think about the kid on the ridge. O'Connell was a ghost, a problem that had likely been solved hours ago by a German patrol. He was the lucky one. His death was probably quick, a single bullet in the fog. We were the ones left to be torn to pieces in the mud. There was nothing to do but lie here, return fire when we could, and wait for the end. We were trapped. We were dying. And no one was coming to help. We were done. Finished. The Krauts were forming up for the final push, moving from cover to cover with the grim efficiency of men who knew they had already won. I could see the shape of an NCO, a Feldwebel by his posture, waving his arm, directing his men to flank what was left of our position. I took a breath, sighted down the barrel of my M1, and prepared to take him out. It wouldn't change anything, but I'd be damned if I was going to die without taking one more of them with me. I squeezed the trigger. But before my rifle could fire, there was a sharp, distinct crack from the woods far to our right, from the direction of the ridge. It wasn't the heavy boom of our M1S, nor the higher-pitched snap of a German Kar 98K. It was something different. The German NCO stiffened, a look of surprise on his face, before he pitched forward into the mud. His men stopped, confused. They looked at our position, then back at their fallen leader. They thought one of us had made a miracle shot. The MG-42, which had been remanned and was firing in short, disciplined bursts, swiveled its attention towards the tree I was hiding behind. The gunner was getting ready to turn me into pulp. And then it happened again. Not a gunshot this time, but a dull thump, followed an instant later by a bright flash and a cloud of black smoke from deep within the ruined farmhouse. The monstrous zipper of the MG-42 stopped mid-rip. We heard screams, high-pitched and panicked, in German. The greatest threat we faced had just been silenced. A stunned silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of the burning Sherman and the moans of our wounded. My men looked at me, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning hope. I had no answers for them. Greco crawled over, his face caked in mud. "Sarge, what in God's name was that? That wasn't our mortars." "Shut up and save your ammo," I whispered back, my own mind racing. It couldn't be. Artillery support? No, the radio was gone. Another platoon? No one was crazy enough to come up that ridge. The Germans were in disarray now. They were shouting, pointing not at us, but at the woods behind them. They had finally realized the attack wasn't coming from their front. They were the ones in the trap. A single rifle cracked again from the ridge, methodical and calm, and another German soldier crumpled to the ground. Then another. It was precise, deliberate shooting. Not a panicked spray of fire, but the work of a hunter. Panic began to spread through the German ranks. Their vaunted discipline was cracking. They started firing wildly into the trees on the ridge, their tracers zipping into the empty woods, searching for a ghost. Then came the masterstroke. A bright flash lit up the woods behind the German line, followed by a concussive boom that shook the ground. A German Opel truck, probably full of ammunition and mortar rounds, erupted into a pillar of fire and black smoke. Secondary explosions started popping off like firecrackers, sending shrapnel and debris flying through the air. The German assault didn't just stall, it broke. It completely shattered. They were now a disorganized mob, caught between us in the front and a phantom killer in their rear, with their own ammunition cooking off in the middle of their position. The mortar rounds that had been plastering our foxholes stopped. The pressure was off. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe. I saw my chance. Preacher, Greco, covering fire on the farmhouse. Davies, get the walking wounded back to the tree line now. Move, move, move. The lieutenant, his face pale with shock, didn't argue. He just nodded and started helping the medic pull our wounded men back to relative safety. For a few precious minutes, the chaos was our ally. We weren't soldiers in a kill box anymore. We had a chance. A ghost had given us a chance. I lay there, watching the enemy's position burn, listening to the single, methodical rifle shots that continued to ring out from the ridge, each one a nail in the coffin of the German attack. I didn't know who was up there. I didn't know how they had done it. All I knew was that they were saving our lives, and I wasn't going to let that miracle go to waste. "All right," I yelled to the men who could still fight. "Get ready to push. On my mark, we're going to give these bastards hell." The German counterattack had been broken, but the trap still had one final set of steel jaws. We heard it before we saw it, the low-gear groan of an engine and the clatter of tracks on stone. From behind the burning shell of the farmhouse, a Stu-G assault gun emerged. It was a squat, ugly beast, a casemate tank destroyer with a long-barreled 75mm cannon poking out of its thick frontal armor like a hornet stinger. It didn't need a turret. Its job was to point at something and kill it, and right now, it was pointing directly at us. The ghost on the ridge had done the impossible, but he couldn't kill a tank with a rifle. This was the end of the line. The handful of us left alive were about to be erased from the earth by high-explosive shells. The Stu-G lumbered forward, its machine gun chattering, forcing our heads down. It stopped about 70 yards out, a perfect firing position. I watched, mesmerized by the sheer finality of it. This was how it ended. In the mud of a forgotten forest, killed by a machine that didn't even know my name. The main gun depressed slightly. I could see the black maw of the barrel, a perfect circle of death. I braced for the blast. Instead of an earth-shattering explosion, I heard a frantic clanging sound, like a blacksmith hammering on an anvil. A grenade. A single, perfectly thrown grenade had detonated right on the Stoogee's rear engine deck. It wasn't enough to destroy it, not even close. But black smoke, thick and oily, began to billow from the engine vents. The assault gun, its engine choked and dying, lurched to a halt. Its main gun was silent. A hatch popped open and two crewmen in black uniforms bailed out, only to be cut down by a volley of fire from Preacher's Bar. And then, from the ditch running alongside the road, a figure rose. He was covered head to toe in a slick layer of mud and grime, a walking creature of the Hurtgen forest. It was O'Connell. He walked toward our position, not running, not crawling, but walking with a slow, deliberate exhaustion that was more terrifying than any charge. He held his M1 Garand at the low ready, its wood dark with moisture, his long artist's fingers wrapped firmly around the stock. His face was a mask of mud, with only his eyes showing through, and they weren't the wide, scared eyes of the boy who had arrived a week ago. They were old as the forest. He slid into my position beside the roots of the tree, the smell of cordite and sweat clinging to him. He didn't look at me, but kept his eyes on the German lines. My men were staring at him, their mouths agape. They were looking at a ghost who had come back from the dead to save them. I couldn't find my voice. What could I say? Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy and low. They had a dummy tank on the road, Sergeant. Plywood and paint. It was meant to draw the Sherman's fire. He took a breath. The real threats were hidden. The MG nest in the farmhouse attic, the Stoogee behind it. I saw it from the ridge. The light was hitting the fake tank all wrong. The shadows, they weren't right. It was a bad painting. He finally turned and looked at me. Hill's clear now, Sarge. I took care of the spotters. He'd seen it. Not as a soldier, but as an artist. He'd seen the flaw in the composition, the lie in the landscape. And he had, with nothing but a rifle, a few grenades, and a terrifying amount of cold courage, systematically taken the whole masterpiece of an ambush apart, piece by piece. He had performed the single most effective act of soldiering I had ever witnessed. I looked at this kid, this failed artist from New York. I saw the grime, the exhaustion, the newfound hardness in his eyes. He wasn't a liability. He wasn't a burden. He was a weapon. I opened my mouth to say something, to thank him, to tell him what he'd done. But the words wouldn't come. They felt cheap, pointless. So I just looked at him, the boy I had sent to die, the man who had saved us all. And I gave him a short, sharp nod. Later that night, long after the medics had come for the wounded and the dead, we sat in a captured German trench, trying to get warm. The silence was heavy. No one spoke of what had happened. They didn't need to. I saw O'Connell shivering, staring into the darkness. I pulled out my flask, the one I never shared. I leaned over and pushed it into his hand. He looked at the flask, then up at me. He took a long pull, coughed, and handed it back. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. We were alive. That was enough.